How do these harmful algae blooms affect other things such as fish? SAV. Okay.
Do I you don't have to do that one
because
you just answered that one, so it's okay.
We want her to define eutrophication.
Yeah.
Eutrophication. Could you define that?
Eutrophication, yes. Eutrophic is talking about food webs. And eutrophic is a condition in bodies of water where there's more than enough mineral nutrients entering the water column. So as we were just saying, there's a whole variety of kinds of different nutrients, and usually a couple of them will be very much in demand by the resident algae, but they're not in such great supply. And in the eastern part of North America, given the nature of bedrock, which is normally where phosphorus comes from, phosphorus is frequently the most limiting nutrient in a lot of waters in eastern North America. So if you add extra, that's most likely the easiest way to get a burst of algal growth, whether you're talking about a stream, a river, or the Chesapeake Bay. And in fact, even in coastal bays, phosphorus still can be oftentimes a limiting nutrient. If you're in the middle of the ocean, it may shift. Some times of year, it may shift to nitrogen. So eutrophication, too much of that, too much plant growth. If you're talking about a lake, a reservoir, a coastal bay, of which there are many problems around the planet, not just Chesapeake Bay, you could talk about the Baltic Sea, South China Sea. You get too much plant growth, and then it starts to decompose, and then oxygen is used up. So that is one problem, or sometimes just particularly in streams and rivers, or else in coastal areas even, you can just get such a huge mass of algae that it becomes physically, difficult for boats to move around. Like before they had the Olympics in China, they actually had to spend a lot of money mechanically scraping up the algae out of the coastlines to make things look good for when they had the Olympics, because that's another coastal area where this is a problem. So it could be a physical issue, it could be working through the oxygen, and in freshwater, again, as in the bay, you can actually favor particular kinds of algae which have very high phosphorus demands, but they have the sneaky ability that they can take nitrogen gas from the air and actually fix it as ammonia. So it's sort of like they self-fertilize themselves on nitrogen by taking it out of the air, and then they can grow even more. If we give them the phosphorus, we're letting these, what we call nitrogen-fixing algae, have a chance to bloom and really take over. So it's sort of like magnifying the initial phosphorus effect of too much plant growth. You can favor the kinds of algae that cause even bigger problems. And perhaps, so even in freshwater and even in the bay, you can get particular kinds of nuisance algae that taste really bad. They make the tap water taste bad. And in fact, certain genetic strains are also very toxic. There's been some ponds and stuff around the area where even dogs have run in to go swimming, and they get out and lick themselves off, and then boom, they die. So there's a particular kind of microcystis, again, that is especially favored by the really high phosphorus. So those are kind of like the really, the really famous and kind of scary kinds of harmful algal blooms. But yeah, the phosphorus sometimes can take a bad situation of eutrophication and make it even worse when you favor the nitrogen fixers.
Okay. What are the best ways you feel that the amount of phosphorus can be reduced in the bay?
Oh, this is a big question, yes, because I'm sure in your class you're hearing about stakeholders. Just generally, the take-home lesson of the past decades for the Chesapeake Bay, if we're talking about the whole watershed, we are concerned a lot about erosion in the watershed. So it's not just Eastern Shore, Pennsylvania, Virginia, up to New York State, Maryland. So on farm fields, that currently is a major source of both nitrogen and phosphorus. So any kind of practices that will minimize erosion. If you're talking dairy farms, you want to, fence off the streams, have planted buffers, things like that. Actually, one of the more successful things they found out, which is actually probably the cheapest, is farmers are growing annual crops, corn and soybeans in the summer, and one of the most effective things they're finding out is once you harvest your corn and soybeans, just put in a cool season grass like winter oats or rye, so that the soil's never uncovered. And it turns out the plants then are absorbing the nutrients. They don't, wash off during the winter thaws or trickle through the soils. And actually in various parts of the country, farmers are realizing that this is actually a pretty cheap thing to do, but it's very, very effective, and it's not that hard to get people to think about it. So on one hand, that works for a lot of places. There are talk about manure storage facilities on larger dairy farms. And one of the problems over the decades has been just sort of the economics of farming. When you had a lot of small family farms with a few cows or presumably smaller amounts of chickens, the food would be grown locally, it's consumed, it gets recycled locally, but when you have hundreds of thousands of chickens, the food is not all being grown in Maryland. I'm sure it's being brought in from somewhere else, and so you're kind of bringing in phosphorus from other parts of the country and concentrating it. So there still is an issue about, well, how do you get the phosphorus physically away from our area and take it someplace else? So it sounds like the soils really are getting close to saturation if they're not already over. And so now it becomes an economic question about, well, what do you do with it? I was aware that they were talking about using the chicken bedding with the feces, as well as the various carbon-containing materials, using that as a fuel and actually trying to do some energy generation with it. I haven't kept up on the details to know what the downsides of that would be, but you'd think, given the coal-powered plants that we have in Ohio, you'd think there ought to be a way to do that and not cause excessive air pollution, actually, that would be beneficial. So I don't know the details on that. And then otherwise, where do you ship it or do something to bring it back someplace else where it's more in need? So actually, this might relate to a later question, but I think that you have to look at the chicken farmers, kind of where they are in the entire web of people in Maryland that like to eat chicken and not pay too much for it. My understanding is that the chicken farmers are they're working usually for a larger corporation that manufactures the food that we eat. And if I go to the giant grocery store, usually I see tons and tons of chicken that have Perdue written on the wrapper. So, and that's the cheap chicken, right? Okay, so the farmers, oftentimes I understand, don't get paid all that much to raise the chicken. So telling them that they have to take the entire financial burden of getting a solution for the manure, it's not entirely fair. It's like, well, the corporations that are asking them, hiring them to grow the chickens, I think that they should be sharing in some of the cost, but then the corporation will complain and saying, well, then the consumers in the grocery store should be able to pay more for it. So I take a more holistic view, and I think, well, that basically people should be paying more for chicken, and there should be some more insurance that either farmers are getting paid enough to be able to do things to ship out the manure or somehow manage it, or else somehow there should be a way of getting somebody, the consumer and the producer have to pay closer to the true cost of raising chickens, and somehow that money has got to be funneled to actually dealing with the problem. So I see it as it's not just like poking your finger at the farmers. I actually would like to keep more like family farms in operation around the area to diversify for food security and just cultural richness. But actually in the United States, I think our food is really cheap. If you travel to a lot of countries in Europe, it's a lot more expensive over there. So I think consumers and food manufacturers could afford to be paying more for this and kind of accept that you're not only keeping the bay a nice place to go, but actually now you're helping the watermen who also have, livelihoods connected to the bay and, all the other industries associated with the bay.
Give us 1 second.